So ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to all of you, both in India and in Japan. Welcome to MIJSC at IIMB Tatsujin Speak webinar lecture series. My name is Sai Pratnam. I am the Chief Operating Officer at this center. MIJSC stands for Mizuho India Japan Study Center, which is a center of excellence at Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. The focus of this center is to strengthen India and Japan bonds by promoting academic, industry, and societal linkages. This webinar series is one such attempt wherein we are bringing in experts from both countries to talk on societal, technological, business, and other facets of life, highlighting both the Indian and the Japanese perspectives. This webinar is the 13th of this series, and we are lucky to have today Professor Happymon Jacob. He is Associate Professor of Diplomacy and Disarmament at the School of International Studies, JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Jacob actually needs very little introduction because he wears many hats and many people know him. But in the next few minutes, I will try and summarize the width and depth of his association. So apart from his professorial role at JNU, he is also the founder of the New Delhi-based think tank called Council for Strategic and Defense Research. Prior to JNU's stint, which he joined in 2008, he has held teaching positions at University of Jammu in J&K and JMI University in New Delhi. He has held research positions at various places like Center of Air Power Studies, Delhi Policy Group, Observer Research Foundation, and so on. He is also an author. He has written a couple of books, Line of Fire, Oxford University Press in 2019, and Line of Control, Penguin Viking 2018. And both these books focus on India and Pakistan links. He is very active on the social media as well. Apart from social media, he's also active on the media. He writes a column in the Hindu and hosts a weekly video show on national security in the wire.in. He is, apart from all the above, he is also active in many forums, both national and international. He is a council member of the governing body of Pugwash International Council, which has got a Nobel recognition for its contribution. And he is also the honorary director of the India chapter, the Chow Chow Track. The Chow Track is the longest running India-Pakistan Track 2 dialogue, having organized more than 28 dialogues between India and Pakistan since 2009, I think. He has also been awarded many awards. Some of these are like he's Emerging Leader Fellowship in 2017, which was instituted by Australia, India Institute, Melbourne University in Australia, and Kodikara Award in 2004, instituted by the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Colombo. So welcome to this forum, sir. I would like to set the context for the discussion for today. The theme for today's discussion is bilateralism or multilateralism, geopolitical alternatives for India and Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. Just to wind up my intro, Dr. Jacob will speak about the combined ability of India and Japan to provide both developmental and infrastructural and normative and security alternatives to the South Asian and Indian Ocean states. Dr. Jacob will give an overview on the theme, which will be followed by a discussion between Dr. Jacob and me. Dr. Jacob has kindly agreed to answer questions which you may type in the chat box. He will respond to this at the end of our discussion. So over to you, Jacob San.
Thank you, Mr. Ratnam. It's an honor to be here, to be invited to be a speaker in this series. My sincere gratitude to Mr. Saideep Ratnam, Ms. Soumya, Ms. Divya, for making this happen. They've been talking to me for some time about how we can potentially do this conversation this evening, and also perhaps work together in the days to come. I am essentially, as Mr. Ratnam pointed out, I'm essentially going to talk about the geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region and the roles that India and Japan have in this region. One might ask why Japan and India. Usually we don't hear of that. We usually hear of India, United States, or India, EU. We hear of India partnering with some of the other nations in the world or groupings in the world. We usually don't hear of Japan. I think that is a mistake. That is a mistake because when you look at India and Japan, a lot has been going on between these two countries, and not many people have noticed that economically, technologically, geopolitically, even to some extent, even militarily, for that matter. And I think in the coming months and years, you will see a lot more from these two countries. Most importantly, I would say that unlike the United States of America or other European powers, these two countries, India and Japan, are resident powers in the region. The others, in my opinion, are mostly non-resident powers, and that comes with its own complications, as it were. To begin with, I sort of want to, because this is my talk is going to be anchored in geopolitics. I sort of want to bring your attention and focus to what kind of geopolitics are we talking about, in which I am trying to situate India-Japan collaboration, as it were. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that we are easily in the midst of a great geopolitical churn in the international system in general, and Indo-Pacific in particular. I think some of the long-term causes for this geopolitical churn, as it were, or hyperactivity, if you want to call it that, are, say, for example, one is the decline of the United States power in the region. If you look around from West Asia to Central Asia, and also perhaps even in the Southern Indian Ocean region, the Americans are slowly but steadily withdrawing their presence. Now, as Fareed Zakaria would put it, it may not be really about the decline of the American power. It may be the rise of the others, the rise of the rest. That could also be a case, but the United States has been withdrawing from some of these regions. And I think that's one major cause for the geopolitical churn at this point of time. The other being, of course, the rise of China. The last 10 years, we have seen the stupendous rise of China in the international system, and a subset of that, of course, is the regional subsystem in the Asian region. But thirdly, I would say the long-term cause, of course, is the inability of the global institutions like the United Nations to provide global governance to the international system. And that is, I think, quite evident. We have a war happening in Ukraine carried out by the Russians. Where is the United Nations? The United Nations is nowhere to be seen. So the decline of the US power, the rise of the Chinese power, the inability of the United Nations, I think these are the long-term causes of the geopolitical churn. Obviously, some of the immediate ones, the causes are the COVID pandemic. And we saw after the COVID pandemic, many of the countries were really battered by the pandemic, by the COVID pandemic. China, in some ways, If you look at the figures, China turned out quite well. Now, of course, they are going back to, I think, a situation of COVID coming back to China. But if you look at the last 2 years, China did quite well when others were really suffering. So the COVID pandemic has really created and damaged economies around the world, especially in the Asian region. The other, of course, is that since the time of President Trump in the United States, we've been seeing a sharpening of the economic competition and rivalry between the United States and China. So these are medium-term sort of causes. But I think I would say the most proximate cause of the current churn in the international politics is the Ukraine war by Russia. This was expected, but no one expected this to happen at this point of time. So this, in my opinion, is the causality of the current geopolitical churn, as it were. Now, this geopolitical churn will have implications for Asia in a more articulate manner than in any other place in the world, be it West Asia, be it Central Asia, be it Europe, be it Africa or South America. Unlike any of these regions, if there is one region where the geopolitical churn is going to have sharper implications and impact, and that's going to be the Asian region. I think that's why we need to sort of be aware of why things are happening the way they are happening. The geopolitical contestations in the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region or the Asian region in general are going to be sharper from here on. The Chinese state has been attempting to, and quite successfully, I would say, replace India as the dominant power in the South Asian region. Since independence, since 1947, India has been the dominant power in South Asia, the primary power in South Asia. India enjoyed primacy. India was the legatee state of the British Empire. Gone are those days. Today, China has taken charge of South Asian region. The Americans have withdrawn from, as I said earlier, from Afghanistan. And given the lack of any energy interests that the Americans have in the West Asian or Middle Eastern region, their interest in that part of the world will also decline over time. You have the Taliban back in Afghanistan. Until a year ago, August last year, you had the entire international community trying to build democracy and a pluralistic society in Afghanistan. They're all gone from there. We have a Taliban, a puritanical Islamist group in power there, supported by China and Pakistan and some of the others. India has, of course, very little access to that particular region. And there is, of course, if I may add one more aspect that is fueling the fire in the region in some ways, is the uncertainty around the Iran nuclear deal. We have very little understanding of whether the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is going to go through or not. If it doesn't, then Iran is also probably going to go into the basket with the Chinese and the Russians in some sense. Right. So how do states in the region that are most affected by the rise of China and the threat of China respond to it? Now, as I said earlier, unlike the United States of America, which of course has power projection in this particular region, they have the ability to go back to the United States of America, which is an island, right? India and Japan do not have that ability. We are resident powers here. Now, the question, therefore, is can Japan and China jointly provide some geopolitical alternatives to the Indo-Pacific region? That's going to be the larger theme of what I'm going to talk about today. But I want to sort of focus on some of the earlier issues that I said a little more. The whole China argument, for example, China has come to, and I am not an economist. You're all, many of you are students of management and economics. You'll be able to correct me. But my own feeling, looking at the figures, is that China has come to dominate the Asian economic ecosystem quite comprehensively. The Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, is an ambitious infrastructure project to get the regional economies orbit around China, Beijing in the years to come. I mean, I was looking at some estimates which says that China has already spent something like $200 billion on various BRI projects. And the country would have spent around 1.2 to 1.3 trillion by 2027, which is like 5 years from now, on various BRI-related projects. That is the kind of power, economic power that China is exerting in the Asian region. Obviously, China is rising not just in Asia, China is rising in the entire international system, and Asia is a subset of that rise. But remember, Asia is China's backyard in some ways, if I may put that very crudely. So China will try and make sure that the region is disciplined and pacified in the manner that China deems fit. I think that's a real danger, as it were. Look at the trade. Look at trade, for example. China is the outside of BRI. India is, of course, not part of the BRI. Outside BRI, China is the biggest trading partner for almost every country in the region, despite the standoff that India and China had in 2020. India's trade with China recently was $125 billion. So there is no way that the countries of the region or the Asian region as a whole can get away from the Chinese economic influence, as it were. China has also tried to sign, in fact, signed several free trade agreements with other Asian states. It is part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. It is part of the CPTWP, the Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States and India are not part of that. CPTWP. India is not part of RCEP. United States, of course, is not part of RCEP, but Japan is part of RCEP, of course. But in some ways, because India is not part of RCEP, which I think it was a mistake for India not to become part of RCEP, it will increase China's ability to economically dominate the region in the years to come. Now, China is the reason why India did not join RCEP, but it will also lead to, therefore, more Chinese domination of the regional economic system, as it were. Militarily speaking, China already has a military base in Djibouti. China is negotiating with several other countries, including next door Sri Lanka. From Myanmar to Thailand to Tanzania to Angola to Tajikistan, Chinese have been negotiating with several of these countries to set up their military bases there. So this is, I think, where India and Japan come in, right? Both are non-Western regional powerhouses, as I said earlier. Both are located in the region and have high regional stakes and high presence. They understand the region more than the Euro-American powers. Do the Americans understand Southeast Asia and South Asia more than India and Japan? I don't think so. So jointly, these two countries can actually put together a strategy to push back the Chinese aggression in the region if they put their mind to it. So, for example, they should probably focus on countries like Sri Lanka now, which are reeling under the Chinese debt trap diplomacy, and also because of other reasons. Of course, both Japan and India are members of the Quad, along with Australia and the United States of America. They are both members of the Malabar exercises, naval exercises, along with Japan, Australia and the United States of America. And of course, within the new, I think the most important catchphrase in contemporary strategic studies is Indo-Pacific. Both have taken to Indo-Pacific in a very, very serious manner. Obviously, the problem with there are also problems between India and Japan. For example, Japan does more trade with China, for example, than with India. As I said, Japan is part of RCEP, India is not. Japan finds very difficult to do trade in India because of various domestic issues. The two sides, Japan and India, also have concerns. For example, the one major concern is about the new AUKUS that has come about, the Australia, United States, and UK defense deal. The feeling in Delhi and in Tokyo is that this defense deal could potentially take the steam out of the Quad and Indo-Pacific to some extent. But the two sides have been, I think I would say, since the time of Prime Minister Abe, things have really spiked between the two sides. The two sides are actually they have an annual summit. They have a special strategic and global partnership. They're very serious about free and open Indo-Pacific. We had the 2+2 talks recently. You had Prime Minister Kishida visiting Delhi. But I think one of the most important aspects of the relationship, bilateral partnership, really is that unlike the Americans and the Westerners, the Japanese and Indians do not preach to each other. They understand each other's sensitivities, they understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, and they tend to quietly work with each other rather than sort of preaching from the pulpit. That has been a major problem for a post-colonial country like India. Whereas Japanese Prime Minister comes here, he's very understanding of the Indian position, tells the Indian government quietly what he has to and goes back. I think that's the way to go. So, I don't need to tell people here the extent of the economic relationship between India and Japan. I'm not going to get into that. But very briefly, how do Japan and India balance the might of China? I think that is something that we as observers, as students, as analysts have to sort of focus quite clearly on. The reason why the two, as I said earlier, as I already said, the reason why these two countries have to balance China in some ways is because both these countries face serious military and geopolitical challenges from China. Japan has its own, maritime issues with the Chinese. India certainly has issues with the Chinese, especially after the 2020 crisis. Before 2020, the feeling in Delhi, I personally thought that we could live with the Chinese and, work together for regional peace and stability and prosperity. But that seems to be a distant dream at this point of time. The two countries, India and Japan, are able to, if they are able to mobilize their resources with a clearly articulated strategy, they can, in my mind, effectively position themselves as an alternative to China in the Asian region. I think what has supercharged the India-Japan cooperation in the recent years has been this grand strategic construct around the Indo-Pacific, in which both sides have great stakes. Prime Minister Abe is in some ways the proponent of the Indo-Pacific. When he spoke in the Indian Parliament, he spoke about the confluence of the two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And now this has become a reality. So creating, I think what the two sides should do is basically try and create non-China-led development alternatives for the region and improving connectivity and infrastructure in the Asian region, which has been one of Japan's priority areas in the region. And India sees Japan as a natural partner in this particular mission. Japan does a lot of things which we don't normally understand. For example, I'll give you, I saw this report recently, by August 2021, that is last year, Japanese companies had invested $259 billion in unfinished projects in Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. How much did Chinese firms invest? Just $157 billion. So you're talking about almost $102 billion difference. That's huge money. So the Japanese have the ability to bring on board the technology and the money. Of course, India has its own India has its own advantages as well in the region. For instance, India has cultural, historical, and political linkages with all the South Asian and Indian Ocean regions, and to some extent even with the Southeast Asian countries. And it has not been, unlike China. China pushes the countries of the region around, with its with certain objective in mind. India has been very conciliatory and diplomatic in dealing with these countries. So if one were to put India's ability to politically, diplomatically, and historically influence the region, and the ability of the Japanese to bring in the technology, the experience, and the money, and for economically and infrastructurally, you're talking about a power couple here, Japan and India, as it were. India doesn't have the monetary capacity, obviously. I mean, India does have some monetary capacity. It has been helping various countries in the region, including Afghanistan. India put in about $3 billion of assistance or more in Afghanistan, from Sri Lanka to Bhutan to Nepal to all these countries. India has been helping all of these countries, but the problem is that the rupee is not a match to yuan, and you know it, I know it, we all know it, and that's where I think Japan has to come in. The two sides, I think, have realized that very well. They have been collaborating in projects in countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bhutan, etc. Even India's northeast, Japan is very active there, because Japan realizes that that's where the Chinese threat is going to come from. In some sense, Mizoram, Meghalaya, Tripura, all of these states, as it were. There is the India, the Asia Pacific corridor, as it were, which is sponsored by both the Japanese and the Indians. In fact, I saw this 2018 example in Bangladesh. The two sides competed against China and won a project to build the Dhaka metro line 6 in 2018. Japan and India outsmarted the Chinese there. So these, as I said earlier, this is a powerhouse, really, in some ways. I'll wind up my remarks in exactly 1 minute. I just want to sort of make a distinction between engaging the region economically and infrastructurally as opposed to militarily. Now, Japan and India will be able to, with of course, the others are also pitching in. The Germans are here in the neighborhood. You have the Americans pitching in a lot of money for development projects in the region, US aid, etc. But the real, I think, powerhouses are India and Japan. I think that's where the real conversation has to take place. However, this model, I don't think, can be replicated in the military defense realm. As you know, Japan is a country without a very active military. It has a Japanese defense forces, but it's not a country that after the Second World War, it's not a country that has developed a very robust military, as it were. There are, of course, some voices within Japan that Japan needs to develop nuclear weapons, that, this, and the other. But I don't think they're going to go down that path anytime soon. So the Indians and the Japanese will have to take the others on board, be it under the rubric of the Quad or any other umbrella. The Americans, the French, the UK, all of these countries will have to be worked together by India and Japan in order to pose to push back the Chinese aggression. I'll just conclude by saying two or three things. One, I think geopolitically, these are exciting times. One shouldn't say that because there's a war going on in Ukraine. But as a student of geopolitics, I must say that this has been probably one of the most exciting times in the last 20, 25 years that I've been studying geopolitics. And I want to also say that India and Japan are both located, and location matters in geopolitics. If anything that matters in geopolitics, that is location. And both are located in the most geopolitically active region in the world today, which is the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region. The two sides will therefore need to take responsibility to shape the geopolitics of the region rather than depending on the West or the US or waiting for the Chinese to take over the matters into their hands. So to do so, they would need to, Japan and India would need to think about synergizing their respective capabilities. They would need to prioritize regions, states, and areas where their cooperation can be efficiently utilized. With that, I will end this monologue and back to you, Mrs. Ratna.
Thank you, sir. I think that has been an excellent overview of the geopolitical situation in this region. You have very effectively summarized that on the economic side, we have a lot going on as a synergy between these two countries. And but on the military side, economic side could be sort of a bilateral sort of partnership, and on the military side, it has to be a multilateral partnership. I think very wonderfully summarized. Thank you. I would like to explore some of these points that you have raised through some more detailed exploration, rather, to understand what your thoughts are, because you are an expert in defense research. So Chinese, even the ancient Chinese war strategy has been typically lead away the goat in passing. And I think that summarizes to a great extent what Chinese have been doing. What probably it implies is that there is a hidden purpose. Through that, you accomplish your regular looking moves. And we have seen this repeatedly, whether it is in the BRI, which you mentioned, or the Doklam, or much before that, IP lost, how Chinese were able to circumvent that. So in this context, considering doing something with a hidden purpose, it can become, as you rightly pointed out, very dangerous for the Chinese neighborhood countries. What would be your advice on ways this can be tackled by countries like us?
Right. I think you're absolutely right about the Chinese ability to misguide, countries not only around itself, but also in the international system. For a very long time, China force-fed the international system that its rise is a peaceful rise, that China is rising peacefully. Now we know that China is not rising peacefully. For a very long time, China was helped by the United States to rise as a power, to be a major economic partner of the United States of America. And today, the United States of America is looking back at its policy, which it adopted for several decades, and realizing that it was probably a mistake, to help China evade a lot of these normal paths of achieving economic prosperity by violating all kinds of intellectual property issues, that, this, and the other. So China has basically taken the international system for a ride, certainly taken the region by surprise by coming out with its true intentions now. Today, China believes that this is the Middle Kingdom, that it is going to be the most important power in the international system. There is very little that the Americans or the Western countries or Japan or India can do individually about it, because this is a power to reckon with. As I said earlier, Chinese economy is so influential that you can't wish away the trade or other similar partnership with the Chinese. So one will have to, I think, synergize their strategies in order to counter the Chinese influence in the region. I think a lot of those things are already taking place. For example, we saw in the case of 5G how the Chinese companies were pushed to the side by the international community, the United States, India, and now some of the non-Chinese companies are being preferred. It took a lot of convincing in India, for instance, that, hey, we should not go with the Huawei as an option for 5G. But finally, we've come around. The kind of investments that China has made in the Indian IT sector is something else that one needs to be concerned. So there are several sectors in India, be it railway signals, be it IT. There are several of these sectors where Chinese investment was growing. I think now it's sort of India is looking at it as a challenge, as a problem. I think this strategy needs to be adopted in several countries in the region and beyond. And for that, there needs to be a certain narrative development, because there is no question that the Chinese have been offering them all kinds of concessions and sops and discounts, at least to begin with. And they have the hard currency to sort of provide to a country when in need. For example, early on in the 2010s, when the Sri Lankans needed money, After the Elam War, after the civil war in Sri Lanka, the international community, the regular funders, IMF or the United States of America, etc., they were not giving any money to the Sri Lankans, and the Sri Lankans went to the Chinese. Chinese were very happy to do that. And now the Chinese the Sri Lankans are in trouble because they don't know how to pay back that money. So I think this narrative needs to be built. Alternative supply chains needs to be built. What one purchases from China, for example, you buy shoes, you buy clothes from China. That's probably fine. But should you buy other electronic equipments, chips, etc., from China? Maybe one should not. So I think these kind of differentiations will have to be made, and that narrative needs to be built, and that narrative needs to be properly created across the various regions. And I think countries like Japan, India, United States, and the European countries can take that lead, because this is a country that means business by any means available.
Summarized many of our doubts, or answered them very briefly, but very nicely you have touched upon. So, but I will like to, this actually covers many of the hidden agendas which the China has been attempting. But there is one great concern, Professor Jacob, what you see in you mentioned about the Ukraine war and how the Russian invasion, I think there's again something hidden agenda, probably, that there was some threat about possible use of nuclear armament in that war. And that is on one side. And the other side, you have China and Russia declaring that their association has a friendship with no limit. Now you put these two together, people in this region are also thinking, what are the possibilities of nuclearization of the border disputes in South Asian and Indian Ocean states, especially those which are having border issues with China. So what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I think that's an interesting question, because this is on the minds of a lot of people, but people are not really articulating or willing to talk about it, because this is, some ways painting a doomsday scenario, and people want to sort of step away from that. But let's take that plunge. I think it is very important to understand the nuclear undertones of the Ukraine war in some ways. I personally don't foresee the nuclear or WMD use, chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons use by the Russians against any party in the Ukraine war, although they have made certain subtle threats. President Putin put the nuclear weapons on high alert, they have said that if another country is helping Ukraine with heavy weapons, etc., they would probably try and dissuade them from using that. So there are very indirect, references to perhaps nuclear, very indirect. But I personally don't think that they are going to use nuclear weapons unless and until you are probably looking at a very, very, very badly defeated Russia. Russia, remember, has probably one of the most highest number of nuclear weapons in the international system, perhaps even more than probably the United States of America. If that is the case, you can't afford to have a losing Russia. A nuclear weapon power is unlikely to be defeated in a direct war of this kind. Meaning the Russians will have to either end the war in Ukraine, or the Russians will have to withdraw from there. It is not possible for anybody to sort of attack Russia and defeat Russia. That's not happening. So if that doesn't happen, what really are the other threats? I think the bigger threat, if you ask me, really is the threat of proliferation. As somebody said the other day, who is the smartest guy in the room today? It is Kim Jong-un. Why? Because the man kept the nuclear weapons program alive despite all kinds of threats and challenges and blackmailing or sanctions by the rest of the international community. And today, therefore, nobody can touch the North Korean regime. We also had Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 or something, and 2003 you had Saddam Hussein. Both of them were toppled because they didn't have nuclear weapons. So Iran will probably start rethinking about nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan will probably start thinking about increasing the stockpiles of their nuclear weapons. So you're probably looking at a lot more nuclearization of the international scenario in some ways, without, of course, any structures or mechanisms or dialogue platforms that are efficiently working to take care of the nuclear threat. The NPT, the NPT review conferences do not achieve anything. The CTBT is still to enter into force. So you're looking at a chaotic international system, as I said earlier, in which nuclear proliferation will add another layer of complication and challenge, as it were. So I think that's so in the South Asian region. I think the Indians and Pakistanis have behaved well in the recent past. Look at the accidental firing of the Indian BrahMos missile into Pakistan. Pakistan dealt with that quite maturely. The Chinese have never really, talked about nuclear weapons, at least in the India context. So I think the region perhaps is, but in general, in the international system, you're looking at more nuclear dangers. Going forward, you probably have nuclear terrorism, nuclear black market, like we used to have in Pakistan by AQ Khan. So I think the dangers have increased, but I don't think there are any immediate threats as it were.
Thank you. I think that is quite a reassuring comment, considering that these flexing of muscles. But as you rightly said, some amount of maturity is being shown by our neighbors. So, as you said, we are unlikely to see it, at least in the near future. But I hope this is not one of those leading away the goat type of behavior by these our neighbors. But now, looking at some of the other aspects about the economic aspect, which you said is one area where India and Japan could work together very well. And you did mention about the BRI or Belt and Road initiative, which is huge amounts of money being invested by the government. There are many question marks on the BRI as well about human rights violations and environmental impact that these initiatives are having across sensitive areas like the Himalayas and things like that. But more importantly, the debt trap. You did hint at it, that the debt trap diplomacy is resulting in some sort of a neo-colonialism, as you might call it, and economic imperialism. So in this context, you did say that India and Japan could attempt to counter, and you did give the example of Japan's contribution. Could you just elaborate on that and explain how Japan and India, Japan financially and India culturally, work together to counter or increase the economic influence in this region?
Right. I think first of all, it is important to understand two aspects. In my opinion, there are two reasons why China is focused on infrastructural developments in the region. Number one, there is a massive production overcapacity in China. For a very long time, China was growing the boom years, as it were, the boom decades, as it were. China was growing so fast and so quickly. And today, suddenly, there is a modest growth rate that has set in as far as China is concerned, compared to the boom years, of course. So they can't keep the production or infrastructure development running the way it used to happen in the earlier years. So they will have to use this overcapacity, in the sectors such as steel or cement or aluminum in other countries. So there is this desire to sort of export Chinese labor, Chinese material, and Chinese capacity to other countries, across Asia and even towards Europe. That's number one. Number two, as you said, this is also the articulation of power by a rising power. And there may be other hidden agendas behind it. And I think there needs to be more considered studies about how is this happening and what they really are trying to do. I was looking at the whole debt trap issue the other day, and it's revealing that China has taken the lead in establishing an impressive list of international financial institutions to support the BRI projects, as it were. Some of them being, say, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You have the Silk Road Fund. You have the New Development Bank, the Contingent Reserve arrangement. All kinds of tools that the Chinese have come up with in order to fund the Xi Jinping signature 8 trillion infrastructure investment plan in Asia, Europe, and Africa. 8 trillion. I mean, that's 4 times India's GDP, as it were, or 3.5 times India's GDP. So that's the kind of money the Chinese are dealing with. Now, it's not going to be easy. I mean, look at the Sri Lankan example, for example. The Sri Lankan debt was so bad that they had to sort of give up the Hambantota port. 85% of the Hambantota port or something to the Chinese for a 99-year lease. This tells you how the debt diplomacy works on the ground. China would help you when you need your money. And you are then unable to pay the money back, and they will tell you, okay, we are taking over this infrastructure, be it a port, be it something else. They take over that. Once they take it over from a weaker country like Sri Lanka, or in Gwadar tomorrow in Pakistan, we don't know what they're going to do with that. That's the Indian worry, right? I mean, India is looking at Hambantota, which is not too far from southern India. And if the Chinese actually establish a military base there tomorrow, what are we going to do with that? It's a great listening post as far as China is concerned, and it can actually curb Indian activities in the southern ocean, in the southern Indian Ocean. It will curb the movement of a lot of other countries, including the Japanese. So I think the threat is quite clear. The problem is that India has only woken up to this quite late. Look at our track record as far as economic engagement in the region is concerned. In South Asia, for example, there is very little intra-regional trade happening in South Asia led by India, compared to, say, for example, in ASEAN or in EU, there is very little intra-regional trade. India is not even willing to be part of the RCEP, for example. But today, there is a certain amount of enthusiasm. We are signing FTAs one after the other. So India is now woken up to that challenge. The Japanese already knew about this, so they have actually been engaging the region quite smartly. Now, as I said earlier, you have to have the right kind of narrative. You have to synergize. You have to know which country to sort of focus on, which sector to focus on. So I think more than that, I am not so sure if there are any ready answers, as it were, because China is clearly dominating from RCEP to regional economic integration to all of this. China is really the one that is leading the way. So I think the only way this can be dealt with, and again, I'm sorry I keep taking the Sri Lanka example, but the Sri Lanka example is a good one, because, I mean, just to a 30-second point, you had a situation in Sri Lanka where, because of COVID, the tourism was not happening, and over 10% of their economy depends on tourism. And then you had poor economic decisions by the Sri Lankan government, including insisting that only organic fertilizers would be used in the country, as a result of which the farming sector went down. Chinese actually, the Sri Lankans actually purchased a lot of fertilizers from China. But Sri Lankans actually had to send it back because the fertilizers were contaminated. And when the Sri Lankans said that we are going to send it back, they started creating all kinds of hurdles for the Sri Lankans, including filing cases in Singapore against Sri Lankans. At that point of time, India reached out and provided the Sri Lankans the necessary fertilizers. Now, what that tells you is that the Chinese will move up. And it is when they make these serious mistakes and they don't understand the region, the culture, the history, the language, they don't understand it. So I think that's where India has real ability, along with Japan, in order to sort of reach out and set the narrative, set the systems right in those countries.
I think you have hit the nail. So even a country like China, which so far does not seem to have made major mistakes, or it has been able to cover up those mistakes, is likely to do it. And that is when we need to capitalize and work together as financial and cultural combo between these two countries to counter such a. I recall that I think India and Japan together made some proposal about in Sri Lanka. I think was it a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, for developing a port.
Colombo City Port City project.
That went. That got I think cancelled.
Cancelled. Yes.
So I think it has to be a combination of, and when these two, I can call China now a superpower, sort of superpower in the making, yes. So when they do an error or mistake or something, if they slip, that is when you think we can get it. Great.
Yes.
Because as you rightly mentioned, debt trap is something that they have been working on, debt trap diplomacy, you can call it that. And there is very little we can do currently to address it unless they make some mistakes. I would now like to explore, Professor, another important point which everybody is talking about is about the supply chain. And India and Japan, according to you, what can these two countries work together to end China's control of, it can't end as a substitute. I won't say end because it's very, very impossible, I think, currently to end China's control, but reduce the impact of China's control of the global supply chain, so to speak. And India's manpower and Japan's technical expertise is in this aspect. Do you think multilateralism or bilateralism is the way forward?
Thank you for that question. I think that's again an interesting and important question. As far as India is concerned, there was a feeling when Trump declared this economic war on China, there was a lot of hope in India that many of these firms were going to relocate to India. But that unfortunately hasn't happened. I mean, maybe a few have come to India, but many of these firms face labor-related, land-related, and other problems in India. It takes time to set up a company in India, and the ease of doing business hasn't really improved all that. So the hope about many of these countries, many of these firms coming into India from China, that hasn't really worked. Had that happened, we would have been in a better position to sort of shape the regional economic intercourse, as it were. But thankfully, many of these firms are actually going to set countries like Vietnam or Philippines, for that matter, which is again a good thing. But I think the trouble for India is that because it is not part of RCEP, and this is really RCEP is really an FTA that brings together three of the world's largest economies, right? South Korea, Japan, and China. And India is not part of that. I think India, therefore, loses out in a big way, because RCEP is going to be a supply chain of certain kind, arrangement of a certain kind. There's no way that we can take away from that fact. So I think in some ways, under the rubric of the Quad, for example, you had the vaccine supply chain under the rubric of the Quad. That was a good answer at the time of the COVID. You had the Indians, Japanese, Australians, and Americans coming together to provide COVID vaccines to the region. That was, I think, a good initiative as a supply chain initiative. And now today we have a supply chain resilience initiative among India, Japan, and Australia. I think that's again another beginning. And thirdly, you're looking at a lot more FTAs now. FTA is in many ways is the way to go ahead. If you don't have more open economic intercourse with countries in the region, you simply can't be part of the supply chains. So I think we've woken up quite late, but we haven't really lost the initiative completely. But as I said earlier, again, China is indispensable. Be it individually, bilaterally, be it multilaterally in RCEP, and some of the other regional economic partnerships. China is indispensable. So we can only try and work around the Chinese challenge. There's no way we can displace it. But I think it is possible in certain sectors like high technology, sensitive technology, where national security implications are. So one will have to pick and choose one's fights. You can't tell that we will not buy anything from China. That's not happening. We'll have to say with which country, what product, and what area we'll focus. I think that conversation needs to happen a lot more.
I think this high-tech area which you mentioned, I think that is again a possible opportunity, because I was reading recently a very interesting tidbit about how chip manufacturing, not just making it, but the equipment which is depositing an atom thick material, silicon, onto a chip. Very interestingly, these are Western makes, and not the Chinese. So interestingly, if you control that, many of these Japanese, German, and US companies are controlling that type of technology so that it could mitigate the over dependence on Chinese chips.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think you are right. You need to do some combo. Yes. So I have a few more questions. With your permission, I would like to ask you one more question, which you hinted at, that the role of world bodies is becoming weaker and weaker, especially in the UN. We have Russian and Chinese veto powers, which to a great extent has influenced whatever inability of these bodies to work, either in Ukraine war or in India, India, Pakistan, China, problems that we have been facing. Just as a food for thought, we would like to pick your brain. Are there any other bodies with whom we could work together, Japan and India, to fulfill the vision which has been articulated in the India-Japan partnership for peace and prosperity? So is there something that these two countries can work together to focus on the peace and prosperity in Asia and the world? That is number one question. Linked with that is how we can involve the other Asian countries to fulfill this vision?
I think you are absolutely right about the weakness of the contemporary international governance structures. There is very little to expect at this point of time from the United Nations, a body that was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War by the victors of that war. I think that the fact that it was set up by the victors and it reflected the world politics at that point of time in 1945, and today it doesn't reflect the realities of the world. One, it doesn't reflect the realities of the world, and today many of the founding members are discarding the importance of the United Nations themselves. We are probably, somewhat more uncertain about the future of global governance in some ways. There's a lot more chaos, as it were, in the global governance frameworks. So therefore, there will need to be a lot more rethinking about what kind of bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral efforts can be undertaken in order to strengthen security, stability, and prosperity in the Asian region. Clearly, I think one important body in my mind is G20. And we have the G20 meeting in Asia this year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia. And we have the next G20 meeting 2023 in India. So India will be hosting the next G20 meeting. Both Japan and India are members of G20, so are the other world powers. So I think that is one forum where the two sides will be able to cooperate quite a bit. But apart from that, there are minilaterals like, say, for example, Quad, Malabar exercises, etc., and there are a lot more bilateral activity happening. Unfortunately, India and China seem to be part of several more such forums than India and Japan. Say, for example, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or BRICS for that matter. Both India and China are members of that RIC, Russia, India, China. So therefore, I think one has to get a little more innovative about creating more institutional frameworks in the Indo-Pacific region involving both India and Japan. Unfortunately, as we know, India is not part of the RCEP, so we missed the bus on that. But I think we need to get more serious and innovative about creating more institutional arrangements in the region, or we will be giving the region on a platter to the Chinese greed.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. I think you have brought in a very frank and open exploration of the possibilities. And there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat box, but one question I would like to, I would like your thoughts on. Talk about the China, Pakistan, the Turkey axis, which is, what do you think we can respond, whether Japan or India and Japan together? What are your thoughts on that?
Is that the first question here? Which I'm trying to see which question it is.
It is, I think, the very first one. Yeah. It says, do you think the China-Pak-Turkey axis presents an imminent threat to India's stability and growth? Do you expect Japan to help in addressing this threat?
Right, I think that's an interesting question because China and Pakistan. I mean, I don't really look at Turkey as forming a major part of any axis in the continental region, as it were. I mean, when I look at India's geopolitics, I divide that into two. I look at the continental geopolitics as somewhat different from the maritime geopolitics. So you have in the continental sphere, you have Central Asia, you have China, Pakistan, Russia, and if you go westward, you have, of course, Turkey there, Iran to some extent. But and of course, In the continental maritime sphere, you have all the other maritime powers, including Japan. So in the continental sphere, I don't. While there are close relationship between there is close relationship between Pakistan and Turkey, China and Turkey, etc. I don't see Turkey playing a major role in the continental sphere. They did play some role in, of course, Afghanistan. They did host a peace talk between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul, or in Turkey, some other city perhaps, but they haven't really played a big role. So I would sort of desist from calling this a axis as it were. Having said that, I think the bigger question that you are probably asking, Ravikant, is about, Sridharan, is about whether Japan can expect to help in addressing this challenge. I am quite, I'm not very, let's say, enthusiastic about the Japanese ability to help India in the continental sphere beyond the immediate neighborhood, as it were. Remember, Japan comes across as a country that is focused more on geoeconomics, not on geopolitics. Right, and that's why I said earlier, when it comes to economic and geo-economic issues, Japan and India would make a great team in the region. But when it comes to geopolitics, we would have to sort of get help from other countries as well. So the perfect fit for that challenge, to address that challenge, really is not really Japan, I would say, because Japan's ability to assert or involve itself in the continental sphere is somewhat limited.
Just a last question. It says India and Japan have been in touch through Buddhism for more than 2,000 years, probably a little more. Today, how can we use these old contacts to strengthen the relationship? I mean, you did address this, but this is going back to the softer aspects. Buddhism, of course, is on the cultural aspect, but the link between India and Japan has been strong, even in more recent years. I mean, economically, they have been giving us a lot of aid, and also a lot of trade is happening between us. But it is not talked about much, or it is not leveraged as much. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's an absolutely important question, Kameshwar, because for some reason, China has been taking lead in organizing all these civilizational conferences around conversations around Buddhism, trying to create those Buddhist shrines, trying to create narratives in the international system about, among the international community, within the international community about Buddhism, whereas Buddha was never in China. Buddha was in India and Nepal. So I don't see why India is giving the legacy of the great tradition of Buddha and his teachings and that history to China. India should claim that back because it rightfully belongs to India. And of course, Japan is a Buddhist country, and there are great civilization links between the two. And I think the entire East Asian region, Buddhism has a role as far as soft power is concerned. So instead of letting China take Buddhism and run away, the real stakeholder, which is India, should work with countries like Japan or even Nepal, for that matter, and create that Buddhist consciousness in the region. I think that is an absolutely important soft power tool that India can use in order to enhance its cultural influence in the region, which we should.
Maybe because Japanese got introduced to Buddhism through China, that not directly. So maybe they are using that as the
that's a possibility.
To claim it. Yeah. Wonderful talk and wonderful thoughts you have shared with all of us this evening, Dr. Jacob. And we are very much obliged that you could find time to do this for us. And I'm sure that the audience has, some of the audience is wanting to know whether they can share it and with you some more thoughts or questions. And I think Soumya has put on the chat box your email address. So please, Dr. Jacob is very happy to answer some of your questions on this. So thank you again, Dr. Jacob, and namaste from IIMB, IJSC, and we look forward to continued interactions in the future.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ratnam. It was a great pleasure and honor being part of this lecture series, and I enjoyed every bit of it. And thank you for listening to me, all your very, very important questions. All of you have a nice evening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye.